Hey guys, how are you doing? Let's take a look at operating systems. I'm going to talk about different stuff than they talk about. There'll be a little crossover, but I do think there's some things you need to understand about what's out there and how it's out there. They keep their videos short, don't they? Which is really nice, but they leave out a ton of stuff too. So the main things that I wanted to mention is that operating systems are really divided into these three groups that you see on the screen: desktop, mobile, and server. There are tens of thousands of operating systems. Every single thing that has a computer in it has an operating system. It's just that we don't think of it that way, right? We don't think of the fact that our car that's got a computer in it has an operating system in there. And we don't think about our old microwave that we hit the popcorn button and hit start is actually an operating system. It's a very rudimentary operating system, but nonetheless, it's an operating system. So operating system is just that general term that means this is the piece of software that interacts with the hardware to get the work done, right? If you just got the hardware, then you got nothing. It's a doorstop. You got to have an operating system that's going to allow you to use the hardware. So Windows 10 by and far is the biggest one that you're going to find out there for desktops. If you went into support today and you were working for a software company that does grading systems for schools, you would be supporting Windows 10 most. Now, these days, right, it would probably be a browser, so Edge or Chrome or something like that, but it would still be what are you running this on, right? What operating system is this running on? Mac OS would be the next. One of the things that I took exception to is that they actually said, oh, you'll do Windows 10 or Linux. It's like, what? You do Linux if you are actually doing the server side stuff. If you're not doing server side stuff, nobody's calling you in going, I got a Linux computer trying to run your software. That I can't even tell you how much further down the list Linux is from Mac OS, right? It's just way down there. And that doesn't mean I don't like it. I teach, an operating systems class, CMP 113, and when it's time to talk about Mac OS, I'll rip on things that Apple does wrong, I think, and I'll rip on what Microsoft does wrong, and I'll rip on what Linux does wrong. I am not tied to an operating system. As a matter of fact, me myself, I get bored. I think my first real like and love of computers was dealing with the operating system. So I just loved messing with different ones. That's really what you would call a hacker. These days, hacker means something totally different. But back then, it was just somebody who messed around with the operating system. So Linux, you're not going to really worry about. However, because they're teaching you Linux, you'll know how to do some pretty heavy-duty stuff on Mac OS because it's Unix. Now, Unix was the first operating system. It really was. For PCs, it really was. Everything kind of came from Unix. Unix was on mini computers. It doesn't matter. I won't go into the details on that. But Unix is old. It's from 1969. That was the first version of it. So Linux comes from Unix. They're so similar that there's tons of things that are developed on Linux and then ported to Mac OS because Mac OS is Unix based, and so it'll run easily on that. And so, as a matter of fact, Linux gets its name not because Linus decided to name it that. It's because he had a home folder on a Unix computer, and the administrator of that computer always put UX on the end of people's directories. That way, people would know that what they were running on, that they were running on Unix. And so he took the first three letters of Linus and added UX. And then people started downloading this operating system from a Linux folder, and that's where it came from. Kind of strange, but true. Mobile, again, Windows 10 is mobile. There's not really a phone for it anymore, but it runs on tablets without a problem, and it's the same as the Windows 10 you run on your desktop. iOS, it's a version of Mac OS, so it's Unix, and Android is actually Linux. And on the server side, and honestly, this stuff will influence you more. When you get into customer support, you often are the person that's helping an individual with information that's on their computer, but they need to get it off of a server, and something's going wrong. And the major server systems out there are Windows Server, and those are used heavily within organizations. So if you were working for a company supporting users within a company, you would work a lot with Windows servers and what you have to do there. Linux is the next thing that's used in that kind of company area. However, Linux is actually bigger in the web server space, like running websites and things like that. And so if you get into that, you'll really need to know Linux. There is a Mac server, and it's the same as Mac OS. It just has some added stuff in there. But again, see, they would have had to purchase that. And the way they do all of their assignments, you're actually logging into a Windows server for your Windows assignments because they're so similar. And then you're logging into a Linux server to do the Linux assignments. And how do we do the Mac stuff, right? They would have to buy all these Mac servers and be costly. So in my opinion, they kind of was like, oh yeah, you're going to use Windows 10 and Linux, not really Mac OS, because they didn't want to bother with setting that up. And then actually other versions of Unix are out there. So not just Mac servers, not just Macs that use them, but there's different versions. Sun OS for Oracle uses their own version of Unix. But Unix and Linux, Mac are all very, very similar. Anyway, that's enough for the operating systems. Let's take a look at file systems. A few things I wanted to mention there. They mentioned journaling. I want to mention first off that on a file system to a computer, everything is a file. So that whole directory structure that we're going to take a look at is for us. It's for helping us organize things. For the computer, it's all ones and zeros that are all down there on some storage device someplace. It doesn't see like we do, right? We need to see that directory structure. We need to see those nested folders in there. It doesn't. And so everything in a computer is a file. And then they set different flags on those files to mean that's a directory and that's a subdirectory and different things like that. We don't need to get into that. I just wanted to mention it. And then modern filing systems, like they said, are journaled. What does that really mean? Well, back in the 80s, if I was sitting there and there was an electrical storm and all the power went out, my computer might not boot again because the system wasn't journaled. And so, you just cross your fingers, you turn it on and hope that the system would come back up. Getting back to the file you had, oh heavens, that's not going to be there for sure. But hopefully it would boot. So what a journaled file system does is it keeps track of what's going on. So let's say I'm copying 400 pictures and it's on 292 when the lightning strikes and the power goes out. When I reboot the computer, it's going to take a little longer because what it's going to do is it's going to look at that journal for the filing system and it's going to go, what the heck was I doing? Where was everything? I was copying this information from this directory to this directory and I was actually on this file. Well, that file only halfway made it there. So I'll delete what was already there and now the person can go on. And so when you open up the directory or the folder, you see half of those files in there and you're like, well, I got halfway through, right? That's what a journaled file system does. It enables the system to recover politely and correctly. And all modern operating systems have journaled file systems. All of them do. And so you're not using a computer these days that uses some crappy unjournaled file system. Linux has ext4 and 3 was journaled as well. And of course, NTFS is journaled, and Apple file system is journaled. So that journaling is really important. And to me, that's a fundamental thing from tech support standpoint. Why can that computer actually come back on? Why is it able to do that? Is that just a mystery? No, there's actually a thing where it's writing in a text file where it was, what it was doing, which little tiny bits and blocks it was moving. All right, so on Windows, you know that everything's mounted as letters. Drive C, drive D, drive E. Mac OS and Linux just use names. And you can also, of course, give your drives a name in Windows as well. But all of it behind the scenes use these different names, and we're going to take a look at that. So there's a Windows directory structure, as you know. I just pulled this off the internet just so you can see the nested folders and such. C drive, then there's the DB2 directory, there's documents and settings, and on and on. We'll look on this Mac at its directory structure, and this is the Linux directory structure. And so Linux, interestingly, when it first started, and it started in the 90s, so it was like 96, it didn't have a journaled file system. It wasn't journaled. And what that would mean is that if the power did shut off, you could corrupt the entire disk. And so what they did was they would mount different storage units in different places so that you wouldn't corrupt everything. And so when you look at this list, this is the standard setup. These are the directories that are there in the Linux directory structure, and there's kind of more of them than there is in Windows and Mac. That's because in Windows and Mac, they had journal and file systems first, and in Linux it came along later. And so these are the standard ones: bin, those are your essential user commands, and boot, what's booting, and dev for the devices, and so on. And that's what you see all the time if you were on a Linux machine, and you will be. So when you start doing their stuff like, oh, create this folder and do that kind of stuff on Linux, this is what you're going to see. The other thing to point out is notice that they use forward slashes instead of backslashes. Macs use forward slashes because it's Unix. Linux uses forward slashes. Windows is the only thing that uses backslashes. And this is something I need to point out. I know it's kind of silly, but notice that slash that's representing the root directory of the entire file system leans forward. That's why they call it a forward slash. If that was a board and you stood it straight up, after a while it's going to fall over, or immediately, and it'll either fall forward or it'll fall backward. And for us in our society and all of Europe, falling forward means going to the right, falling backwards means going to the left. And so those are all forward slashes because they're leaning forward to the right. Backslashes lean backwards to the left. And those are on your keyboard. Forward slash is underneath the question mark. Backslash is usually above your enter key. And you'll need to keep track of that because you're going to actually do things at the command line later. All right, so I already opened up disk utility. And really what I wanted to show you here is as they specify, APFS is the new file system, and this is encrypted file system. Apple came up with this Apple file system because almost all of their devices now are using the flash storage, the solid state drives. And hard disks, they are used to reading and writing, reading and writing, reading and writing. And that reading and writing over and over again actually lessens the longevity of a solid state drive. And so they went from their HPS Plus to Apple file system on anything that's a solid state drive. So anything that's just a standard hard disk, they really haven't moved to this yet. They're still using their older file system. Microsoft's doing the same thing if they haven't already done it. But what they'll do is just upgrade NTFS. I think NTFS is on version 5 or something like that. And so they'll just upgrade that, and then it'll just know, okay, that's a solid state drive, so we need to take these things into account when we use it. So that's the change in the drive formats there. In any case, this is the actual name, this disk 1S1. That S used to stand for SCSI, now it's SATA. Anyway, so that's actually the name of the hard disk, although this is what I see, Macintosh hard drive. That's the standard name. So in Windows, it's the same thing. You'll have a label, like you called it My Stuff or whatever, and it's drive C, but it'll have something behind the scenes that actually truly identifies it as what it is. Same thing in Linux too. To me, that's kind of an important little tidbit that you need to know, and the reason why you need to know that is because it's tech support. You need to understand that there's a way the system addresses the drive, and that's this name here. And then there's a way that we as users address the drive. And you may say, well, why do that? Why not just make them the same? Because it would have to be the way the system wants to address it. Being able to change this name is great because I can actually come right here and rename that to Mac hard drive or James's hard drive, and it's not going to affect anything. It doesn't change anything. And it's the same on your Windows machine. As long as you're not changing the drive letter, you can change the name of that makes it more friendly to you, and it'll still function and work. The system won't go, oh, I don't know what I'm doing now. So All right, so if you would like more information on any of that, let me know. Or if you've read something online or something that they mention in this certification that you want some more detail on, make sure you ask.